Hello, I'm just starting to get this thing working. Today, I want to get into a quick thing here on generalizations and how we want to avoid some of them and how to be careful. Some generalizations are better than others, but we have to be very careful because when you're making an argument, again, you don't want to leave a lot of room for people to get the wrong idea. Because you don't want them to get the wrong idea. I mean, you want them to, get the idea that you are presenting to them. So, now, one or more examples of in support of generalizations. Women in earlier times were married very young. Juliet and Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet was not even 14 years old. In the Middle Ages, 13 was the normal age of marriage for Jewish women. And during the Roman Empire, many Roman women were married at age 13 or younger. So here are three examples used to back up the comment, women in earlier times were married very young. So what are the premises here? So let's think about what some of the premises are. And as you think about them, when do premises support these generalizations? We have to be accurate. So, if Juliet, for example, was not around 14 years old, or any of the other premises were untrue, then your argument is weaker. You haven't made a very good point. And so, obviously, you have to be very careful about that. The other thing is you can check arguments and check examples to find good examples for your argument. You'll have to do some research, but you also can check out the examples of others to see if they're making good arguments or not, and see if their premises are fitting in with their topic. Because if they don't fit in with the topic, if your premises, again, are very weak, then your thesis is going to be very weak. So even if the arguments are accurate, even then, generalizations can be kind of tricky. And so we have to be very careful. It's helpful to write short arguments in a way that it's helpful to write them in a way so that when we need to see exactly how they work, to kind of double check, think about these premises, think about whether they're working. So, when do premises like these adequately support a generalization? Okay, one requirement is that examples got to be accurate. Start from reliable premises. That is the. Did I skip one? Yeah, there we did. I don't know why we did that. Sorry, guys. So examples have got to be accurate. You got to start from very reliable premises. If any of the premises about women marrying in younger times were inaccurate, they wouldn't have been very good premises. So, if Juliet hadn't been about 14 years old, then this stuff would have been untrue. And so because premises are the foundations that you build your thesis on, you got to have good premises. So you check the arguments, find good examples. Again, research is very important, and that's really important. Even then, you want to make sure that we're careful. So here's some more examples that we can look at. Okay, this may seem confusing. There we go. Now, sometimes a simple example can be used when you're making generalizations to illustrate. So the example of Juliet alone might illustrate early marriage, but does it really, offer support for a generalization that all women married young at a particular time? Shakespeare wrote roughly in the 16th and 17th century, and so that might be accurate, but are we earlier times than that? We don't know. So very often more examples are needed. Okay, and because more examples are needed, this is where you have to look at them. Here's an example, French fries are unhealthy, high in fat. Therefore, all fast foods are unhealthy. Now, you can't make a generalization like that. Yes, high in fat's not good for us, but all fast foods are unhealthy? Really? Are they? Well, let's think about this. French fries are... Yes, French fries are unhealthy. They're high in fat, and milkshakes can be unhealthy, high in fat and high in sugar. And deep fried chicken and cheeseburgers are unhealthy and high in fat. Okay, so we know. So the yes version may still be weak though here, because it doesn't get but it does give you at least some ideas to think about. So we're talking about, hamburgers and so forth. But but really, is a generalization about such a small set of things the strongest argument that should be considered? Or at least, think about that. That's what we have to think of when we think of generalizations, In a generalization about small sets of things like this, the strongest argument should consider all or at least many of the examples. So a generalization about a sibling should consider each of the, for instance, each of the instances. And think about this. Even a generalization about, say, planets, might, be the same. So my point in all this is that generalizations need to be, you need to be careful when using them. For example, large sets of things require that you pick out a sample of things, because you couldn't list all women who married young in the Roman period, could you? Not necessarily. And records from 1,000 years ago, well, first you'd have to know Latin, and secondly, is it, not all marriages were necessarily recorded, nor were they needed to be recorded necessarily, women in particular were not as important. I mean, and I don't mean that in Roman society in particular, women, didn't have as big a role at the time. So what you may have to do is, like in our generalization before, is you take a few examples to illustrate your point. How many required depends on how representative they are. So depending on the size of the set that you're trying to generalize about, you might want to make a good sample. To explain, well, here's a good one here. To explain, for example, that your town, the small town that you might live in, is full of remarkable people requires a lot more evidence than the claim that, your friends are just remarkable people. It's an observation. They may be, but is the town completely full of remarkable people? Well, do we really know that? Well, no, and you have to be very careful about that. And you have to be careful because, you would need some good representative examples without having to, come up with a list of all the requirements of, that you would need for all the required people that might be, quite remarkable in your hometown. Now, generalizations may need more than one example. Some examples that that you might need to distinguish or need more than an example. Okay, all birds can fly. Well, you might need to qualify that. Can all birds fly? Think about that. Penguins can't fly. Now, underwater, that might be different. But we're talking, so you may even need to qualify. But flying, there are a lot of birds that can't fly. Ostriches can't fly. Chickens can fly very small. And they are the dumbest animals, let me tell you. So, as a result, you'll need more. Some billionaires are college dropouts. Well, You might need a little more examples of this. Yes, there are some that are dropouts, but I would say the overall majority probably has more education than you would think. Another generalization. Everyone who walked on the moon in the 20th century was an American. Really? You sure about that? All politicians are liars. That's not necessarily true, much as we, like to generalize about that. But, I've worked in politics myself, and worked in Capitol Hill 30 some years ago. Let me tell you, there were a lot of people out there. Yes, there are a lot of people that didn't really care and could, bend the truth. But there were also a lot of good people. And that was very comforting. And they're not all liars. Now, you may need one more examples when you're thinking of generalizations. You may need more than one. So if you're making a generalization, for example, most fruits are sweet when they're ripe. Well, is that true? Not necessarily. I mean, you could say most fruits, but are all fruits? Not necessarily. Olives are considered a fruit and they're not necessarily sweet. Lemons are considered a fruit and they're not necessarily sweet either. Neither are limes and certainly not grapefruits. Most shows on television are not worth watching. Okay, that's a very general statement. Going to have some examples of that. Going to have to, you would need to develop it further to give some examples, maybe even set of parameters, all, whatever. Developed democratic countries no longer practice capital punishment. Well, that's not necessarily true. There are a lot of countries that are developed in democratic countries, mostly in Western Europe, who do not practice the capital punishment. But there are still some countries like ours that, many of the states still do. So, there's some examples there. Again, England has produced famous musicians. Well, that's true. The world's most populous countries are in Asia. Well, we'll need so in other words, a lot of these things, when you're generalizing, you have to be careful because you don't want to make that sweeping generalization. That's not going to help. If you make a sweeping generalization, what happens is you allow people to read into whatever you're writing. Sometimes you want to do that. But in general, you don't because you're trying to convey a particular point. And so if you allow too much input, if you allow too much of parameters to read for people to read into that, then there can be some serious issues. And so that's why you have to be specific. So how do we do this? Well, what we do is we use what are called representative examples. A large number of examples can often sometimes still misrepresent whatever you're trying to generalize about sometimes. For example, a large number of ancient Roman women, for instance, might be able to establish very little about women generally, since ancient Roman women are not necessarily representative of all other people. In other words, it depends on what you're generalizing about. So you have to consider, if you were considering women marrying young or any ideas that you were talking about women in this topic, the argument needs to consider women from earlier times and from other parts of the world as well. So you would, again, more representative is what you're looking for. Here's a good one. A good statement. Everyone in my neighborhood favors McGraw for president. Therefore, McGraw is sure to win. Well, how many of us have actually kind of witnessed that as young people? What we've seen is that, sorry about that. What we've seen over the years is, as you grow up, you might see different presidential signs out. You think, you see lots of them. Kids are not, they're not stupid, and they'll say, they'll win, this person's probably bound to win. But then it doesn't happen, so you'll often ask yourself why. So weak arguments because a single neighborhood might represent a whole voting population as whole, that's a very weak argument. Because that's, how is that little neighborhood that you live in going to represent the whole thing? For example, and what we often find sometimes is that student wards in towns regularly carry candidates who might do poorly in other parts of the town. And we seldom have good evidence about neighborhoods' views, really, this is true. So the set of people eager to display their political preferences to the world is probably not a good representative cross-section of the neighborhood that we're trying to talk about, okay? So a good argument that McGraw is sure to win requires that there be a representative sample of the entire voting population. And that's what they're doing when we do polls, where we're trying to do polls. And it's not easy to construct such an example. And that's why various polling companies make a lot of money when they develop a reliable poll, because once they do that, they can then help aid candidates in their candidates and the press and trying to guess about how things are going. But you have to be very careful, consider them. Public opinion polls are the thing that we construct many samples in this manner. And if they're not in the days of very early polling, it depends on something that's some things that are very important. Here's a classic example of early polling. The Literary Digest did a poll for who would become the next president from their readers. Well, they constructed this poll by using phone book numbers and automobile registrations. Now, automatically, the problem here is once they did that, here's the issue. This is 1936, okay? So, first of all, we're in the middle of a depression. Okay, so who will have phone books? Who will have a phone number? And who will have an automobile registration? People who are rich. Poor people, often they might have a car, most of the time they did not. Telephones, if they could rely without one, they did. Many people didn't have telephones. It wasn't until the 60s that I think there was actually a phone in most everybody's home. But when you're thinking about things like that, another issue that came out as far as polling was concerned was in the early 90s when the internet started to explode. People were doing online polls and predicting and so forth. There was a problem with that, though. Nowadays, it's not such a big problem, but there was a problem early. And the early problem was that a lot of the polls tended to favor more conservative candidates. Well, and then all of a sudden comes election day and the conservative candidates aren't necessarily winning. Well, why would that happen? Well, that's because the people who could afford computers in the early days and could afford to, have the internet service were richer and wealthier people. And richer and wealthier people, would, certainly naturally tend to vote, tend to be more conservative. Not always. But my point here is that, depending on whatever you're looking at. Now, today, if you were to do a poll, looking at a phone book would probably not help you at all as far as a poll is concerned. Think about what the problems are. Number one, how many people have a landline anymore? Really? I mean, I have one, but, not everybody does, okay? Automobile registrations. Now, that would be something that might work. Not everybody has a car, but I would say 90% of people probably of voting age or above might have an automobile. But again, it depends. Polls have improved greatly since 1936, let me tell you. And what we have found in many of them is that many of the things that we have found is that things have changed. And what we found is that whenever you are looking to make a generalization, you have to make sure you're specific about what you're generalizing about. And usually what we find is that most polls are fairly good because they always have a margin of error. Okay, so for example, 2016 is a great example, the presidential election. Everyone says, oh, the polls were all wrong. Actually, that's not true. The polls were correct. The polls predicted that Hillary Clinton would win more votes than Donald Trump, and she did. But that's not how we elect our president. See, and that's just it, and that's the problem, whenever I've worked in politics many times, and whenever you look at polls, I never look at the national polls, because national polls don't matter. The national popular vote in a presidential election doesn't matter, as we have seen in the 2000 election. I remember that one, and the 2016 election. It's the Electoral College, and it's the states that a candidate wins. So new polls have been developed here recently that do much better, and they take a lot of things into consideration, margins of error and so forth. So the question that you have to think about is, what is this poll measuring, and is it really anything that I'm any good for what I need it to do? You have to anticipate the danger, then, is what I'm getting at. Whenever you have some kind of generalization that you want to something you're going to generalize about, you're going to want to anticipate the danger and do some research. Because if you don't, and if you're in a debate or some issue comes up, then you aren't going to look very good if your paper or whatever you've just researched comes out totally wrong, and other people have based their research on your research. So, good example here, Juliet. Will you go back to the Juliet example? Juliet is just one woman, okay? Is she representative of women in her time and place? Maybe. She's certainly a representative as far as, Shakespeare was concerned. In Shakespeare's play, Juliet says, think of marriage now, younger than you, here in Verona, ladies of esteem are made already mothers. In other words, she's saying, women are already having babies. And she says, by my count, I was your mother much upon these. In other words, her mother's telling her, hey, I was about this old when I was having children too. 14 was considered, a certain age among particular groups. The thing you have to remember, though, too, is this is at a time when the life expectancy of the average person, mostly depending on their class, was really only maybe 40 years old in that time period. They might live longer, and that certainly did happen. But more often than not, many people who were the peasants, who were everyday, people, they didn't live that long. It's only been in the 20th century that the average life expectancy, when the 20th century started in the United States, the average life expectancy was about 55 years old. Since World War II, and with the development of better drugs and better scientific applications and so forth, ladies and gentlemen, you can expect to live way into your 80s now. So, depending on how your health is. So, what the passage suggests is that Juliet's marriage at 14 is not an exception. In fact, she might even be considered an old maid a little bit. That's the assumption. So, you want to look for the most accurate cross-section that you can find of the population that you want to generalize about. Okay, so if you're talking about women marrying young in their years, Juliet might be a good example. You might also be able to point to other historical examples as well. And by doing so, you can certainly generalize, okay? Now, that is not to say that all women got married at 14 and younger, okay? So it's just kind of something you have to think about. Now, if you want to know what students think about some subject at your school, for example, do you just ask your friends or the people you would know if you were going to do a poll, for example? Well, of course you don't. You would, if it's your high school class or something, you would do a survey. Similarly, if you want to know what people in other countries think about the U.S., the one thing you don't ask is not going to ask tourists, for example, who come to this country For visits, they're already biased because they have chosen to come here for their vacation. So they're already, in a good position to say, oh yeah, I like it here, and so on and so forth. They're already going to be predisposed. Okay, you would want to maybe ask that question in their own country. Okay, so careful look at this. You might even want to have to look at foreign media to see what they think. And that's something that's kind of interesting. If you want to know what the U.S. has been considered over the last 4 years, I mean, take a look at some of the news and, look up BBC. Look at the BBC, look at the Telegraph. You can look at some of the news from different areas from Europe that are in English, and you'll find that, the U.S. has had an interesting reputation over the last few years. So, this will give you a different example, but you would actually do that as a representative example. Now, the other thing, too, that's important is you've got to train yourself to recognize that you have to understand the sources of sample bias, and you want to understand what they are to avoid unrepresentative examples. So, for example, many generalizations are about diverse groups. An opinion poll showing that Europeans disapprove of capital punishment. Okay. Some of these things are going to be, you got to be careful. No single individual represents all Europeans, though. So you have to be careful. To find a representative example, we would need to find or assemble a group of people that is representative of all Europeans. And right now, if you just look at Western Europe, there are at least 27 different countries here, So you would want to select examples so that your group has the same characteristical groups of all Europeans, the same mix of ages and groups and proportions to men and women, maybe even consider ethnicity and economic, situations. So how do we recognize sources of sample bias to avoid making an error in unrepresentative samples? So a group of examples is called a sample, okay? So, and the implication is that you want your sample to be a representative of the group that you're making a generalization about. So if you were talking about, for example, we go back to women. If we were talking about women marrying young at a certain age, we would want to look and try to make sure that we were looking at different age groups, different countries and so forth, depending on what we were trying to generalize about. A sample that doesn't really work on this, is really called a bias sample, okay? A sample that fails to really develop isn't going to help. And the simple answer to really getting an unbiased example is to make sure that this is a random sample. In other words, if you were going to develop a poll from your high school class, let's say there's 300 people in the entire class, you can't poll the entire class. So you would want to you would want to ask them certain sets of questions, okay, all right, that have already been developed, that you develop, but you would randomly maybe put 300 of these people in the gym and maybe pick each person's name out of a hat, put everybody's name in a hat and then choose 50 of all those names, okay? So in other words, that would be your representative sample, okay? You would pick random people. That way you didn't have a bias in picking all these people, and say, oh, I'm going to pick all the girls or all the boys or, also. So a random sample is that in which every member has an equal chance of being included. And so if you took just 50 of all the 300, like we just mentioned, put all 300 names in a hat, draw them out one by one, that would be an unbiased sample, because the only qualification you had of this is that they had to all be in the class of 2021 or whatever, okay? And that you would be working on developing a sample based on that. Now, are there going to have errors in that? Well, I'm sure there will be, but we'll fix that. So you also have to recognize that the key implication is that you want to make sure that the sample that you have is going to be a good representative of the group that you're making the generalizations about. So if you picked, say, 50 people out of the 500, That might be a good sample, maybe even 25. And then, then you could ask them questions as a representation of the entire group. And this would also ensure that, everybody was random. And that's what they do with that's what they do with polls and so forth as well. They will pick people, and they try to do this in such a way that it is random. So, if you pick a sample of a particular group is a language in which every member of the group has an equal chance of being included, this is great. That way, you've included everyone. Now, how do you collect a random sample? And that's not the same as choosing members of the group haphazardly or without a plan. Okay, the biggest one is to make sure that you are sampling from the entire group that you're making a generalization about. And so, what is the qualification or generalization you were making a generalization about? So, if, for example, if you were making a generalization about the class of 2022, for example, okay, the only requirement would be that you would pick, say, 20, 30 people out of a sample out of the entire 300 population, let's say, that the only qualification is that they're in the 2022 class. So you want to make sure that you're sampling from the entire group. And if your generalizations, let's say about North American college, for example, if you're making a generalization about all North American college students, you're going to want to be sure that you sample students from a wide range of colleges and have a proportionate probability, and make sure that they all have a chance of being included. And what I mean is if you were to do a generalization about North America, just maybe even U.S. college students, you would have to consider, okay, do we do public colleges? Do we do private colleges? If we're going to include all colleges, this would also include community colleges. And in that sample, okay, we'd have to also consider things like age, sex. There would all kinds of parameters, and you don't want to overlook, the difference. You don't want to overlook the difference between students that go to a private college versus students who go to a public college. Large colleges versus small colleges. A college with more than 50,000 students, like the University of Michigan, versus a college like, I don't know, like a little community college up the road with only 2,000 students, is going to have a different kind of point of view than, a much larger college. So, in other words, you've got to make sure that your sample is random and it's actually representing the thing that you're trying to represent. Now, make sure that you would have to make sure, of course, that all students had a proportionate chance of being in the sample, of course. So if you were doing something about North American college students, then, of course, you would, in particular, be looking at college students from all over the United States and various backgrounds and so forth. Now, the other thing is you want to choose your sample in a way to ensure that it is truly proportionate. How are we going to do this? And this becomes kind of an interesting situation too. How would you choose your send out your samples, and how would you choose them? Are you going to use student email addresses? Well, that's going to be interesting. How many of you actually use your student email? And how many would actually respond? That's always a thing. I mean, especially when we talk about other examples and so forth. Now, if you approach students who are not, and the other thing is okay, how, are we going, if we do emails, is that better? Do we want to do a face-to-face account? Okay, that's great. But if you go onto campus, say at a community college, and you only sample those students that are around during the day, you're going to have a different kind of point of view than the students who take evening classes, for example. So if you can only sample a specific group, it's best to change your generalizations sometimes. I mean, if you're going to start out, say, I'm going to sample college students from North America, well, I would say that's ambitious. But the thing about that would be is, already I'm thinking you may have to change that just a little bit because you don't have time to sample all the college students. You would want to be more specific and say, okay, maybe we'll just look at students in this area, okay, or students from this kind of school, or smaller students from colleges that have a student body of 7,000 or less. Okay, so you're going to already have to make it manageable for yourself as well. And you have to be careful. Now, why am I bringing all this up? Well, you got to be careful, because as you do the readings and as you found things in the America Now book and as you look for other things, you're gonna find that a lot of writers who make generalizations, that's their weakness. That's the secret. That's the secret, folks. That's 9 times out of 10, that's their weakness. They're making a generalization about a group of people that might just be a small remark, but boy, is that important. So you don't want to let individual members, and the other thing is, of course, you can't let individual group members choose to be in the sample. You don't want someone, to decide whether they can be in the group or not. If you work for a magazine, for example, and you want to know what readers think about last week's issue, you might track down a random sample of readers and ask them, okay? You don't just email subscribers inviting them to submit their opinion, because, not all subscribers actually read the book, So all subscribers would be invited to join, but only the ones with strong opinions are going to actually reply, and those that have read the material. See, so background rates may be crucial. To illustrate this, I want to talk about this in particular. To persuade you that, let's say, I'm a first-rate archer, okay, is it enough to show that I can hit a bullseye? It's not. It's not enough to show that I can hit a bullseye. It's how many times did it take for me to hit a bullseye? How much practice did I need? How many times did I miss before I hit the bullseye? That would give you a much different point of view as well, okay? So that's important too, and that's something you have to think about, when you look at, even when we see your politicians like to spout off on different ideas and different things, if they say, well, I've won every, if a politician would say, I've won every election that I've ever participated, I've ever run in, sounds good. And if they've run in 5, 10 elections, that's good. But if they've only run in one election, well, they're not lying, but at the same time, wait a minute, hang on, one election and you think you're invincible? Nah. Again, just like in the bullseye situation here, getting a bullseye in one shot tells quite a different story than getting a bullseye 1,000 times. It's how many times you've done something. It's how well you've done something. Here's a good one, too. I love this one. Horoscopes. Horoscopes are the greatest. I mean, talk about a waste of money. Horoscopes are some of the greatest things out there that I think are interesting. Think about this. And we can apply this to other things. If you were to read a paper that talks about the accuracy of horoscopes, you might want to think about that. I mean, it's kind of interesting. For example, let's say Leon's horoscope told him that he would meet a vivacious stranger, and he met a vivacious stranger. Therefore, are all horoscopes reliable? I don't know. And one has to look at cases where horoscopes didn't come true, and then determine the ratio. Of how many were correct versus those who were not. Most horoscopes are very general. They're very inspecific. I think that if you look at a general horoscope it's kind of fun to look at horoscopes in your newspapers or look them up online. But personally, I think that my life is a little more important than to be predetermined by by the placement of the stars at the time I was born. I think I need a little more behind that than, just that. So, as you're to evaluate the reliability, and this is where we're going with all this, to evaluate the reliability of any argument when they feature examples, you need to know that, for example, about the bullseye, you need to know the relation between the number of hits to the number of misses. If he hit a bullseye, 100 times out of 1,000, that's pretty good. So in other words, he hits the bullseye 10% of the time. That would be much more important, but it also means that he doesn't hit a bullseye 90% of the time. But then if you get someone who, let's say, hits a bullseye 400 times out of 1,000, okay, that ratio is much more important when you think about it. He's getting a bullseye 40% of the time. Now, that's just getting a bullseye. There are other things we could be talking about. And these things are not so, and again, sometimes it's how the information is presented. And that's why, just today, in today's society, we have to be very careful, because very often we find that, depending on who is presenting the information, I always get information. It's kind of interesting when some politicians would like to talk about alternative facts. Alternative facts? There's no such thing as an alternative fact. There are facts, An alternative fact would be a lie or a non-fact. Think about that. It's kind of interesting. Another one of my favorite ones is when this gets into things like where we try to debunk things. One of my favorite things here is when we talk about the mysterious Bermuda Triangle. It's kind of interesting. There was a book written in the 1970s that was interesting by a man named Charles Berlitz, and he talked about the Bermuda Triangle. And this is a place where many ships had mysteriously disappeared, and all the people were missing. And there have been several dozen disappearances in the last decade. Well, wait a minute. Is it really that mysterious? When you think about each instance and when it's happened, take each one, and then you think about, weather issues. The Atlantic is always full of weather issues. Think about this, folks. And I remember this. It's only been within the last 30 years, okay, that hurricanes and tornadoes and so forth can actually be tracked on a radar and when Doppler radar was developed and be fully understood. Prior to that, people would say it's hurricane season. We'll have hurricane warnings up. We have these indications. Do we really know if one's coming? They may not know until like the day before. Now you sometimes get 3-4, for a hurricane, you could get up to 3-4 days notice, which is much better, I think. For tornadoes, the lead time between the time a tornado touches down and the time that somebody, that it's made official and an announcement has been made, the lead time to get people to take cover has increased significantly. I come from the times when you didn't have lead time. You had, in the summer, you just watched the weather and made sure everything was okay. And you tried to watch these things. But tornadoes, do happen. I come from the Midwest, so, but, when they do, sometimes you got, 4 or 5 minutes lead time, which is much better than, in the old days when you wouldn't get any. But when we get back to things like the Bermuda Triangle, is it really that mysterious? Think about this. It's really not mysterious. Think about this. It's only mysterious when you think about it. Let's kind of tear this apart here, It's when you consider that this was the highest, this area where the Bermuda Triangle was, since 1500, has been the area of the most increase in shipping traffic in the world. The fact that you have more ships in that area, okay, especially in a time during the summer, which is better for sailing usually, but higher chances of hurricanes, the fact that there would be more um, 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 more accidents is not unusual. It's sad, of course, I'm not saying that, but is it really that mysterious? Not really. It's really not that mysterious. Most of the things have been debunked. We can say, well, I mean, to a certain degree, we can say, well, we know what's happening. There have been instances where there have been a lot of problems regarding things like, compasses going wonky and so forth, but that's not unusual. So you have to, just like with all things, you have to view things critically. Just because somebody says something does not mean it's true. And if they keep repeating it, it doesn't make it true just because they're repeating it. We have this notion that statistics have this aura of definitiveness. In other words, 88% of doctors agree that this medication, is effective. Well, and if 88% of the doctors say that, are we really gonna say no? Well, hang on. Don't turn your brain off. Think about that. Here's a good example. In the 80s and 90s, Tylenol, we all know what Tylenol is. Tylenol used to advertise that they were the #1 brand that hospitals recommended to patients. And they were the #1 brand that hospitals used the most. Well, if hospitals use it, why shouldn't we? I mean, it makes a great conclusion. But then you figure out why hospitals were using it. Why were hospitals using it? Because they were getting Tylenol for free and then charging the patient. In other words, the drug companies, I don't remember who was making Tylenol at the time, but whoever was making Tylenol actually gave Tylenol to the hospitals, and they were then using that drug because it was free. Well, it doesn't take a scientist to figure that one out. So think about that. Here's another one, and this has become more critical today. After an era of some athletic powerhouse universities were accused of exploiting student athletes, leaving them to flunk out once their eligibility expired, college athletes are now graduating at higher rates. Many schools are now graduating more than 50% of their athletes. Well, okay, that's an interesting statistic, but what was this, 50%? That sounds impressive, doesn't it? Okay. But what was their rate before? What was it before? Are they really improving? I mean, yeah, it's great that you're graduating 50% of your athletes, but what was the number before? Okay. Already said that. Now, many schools will graduate more than 50% of their athletes, and it appears that some don't. But so figure, so this may well exclude the most exploitative schools that really concern themselves in the first place. Think about this, Some schools don't offer graduation rates, but it would be useful to know how a more than 50% graduation rate compares with the graduation rate of all students at the same institution. Think about that. How many people actually graduate on time? Or how many people, who start actually finish? And if it's significantly lower, athletes still may be getting a shaft. We've just seen some new things here recently with athletes that they can now profit by using their likeness now. In other words, they own their likeness, which is kind of a good thing. I don't know. I keep times have changed so much that we all often have to change with them. So this is important. And, you gotta, be critical. 50%. Wow. Well, 50% of students, that doesn't sound too great. They're just talking athletes, though. And so you're thinking, that may not sound so bad, but what was it before? So, and of course, we get into a lot of things here, too. A lot of the arguments here is that there's no reason to believe that rates are actually improving. How do we know? Because there's no comparison. Compared to what? And if you were to see that in a paper and say, we have a 50% graduation rate. Well, already you would be thinking, well, really? Okay. And the claim, of course, is that the rate is higher, but they don't really know. But we don't know what the previous rate is, and it's impossible to tell. So in other words, so what we have is incomplete evidence, is what we have. You've got to know, and you don't want to offer an explanation with incomplete evidence, because if you do that, you're really on shaky ground, especially if your whole argument comes tumbling down. Okay, when an argument offers rates or percentages, the relevant background, you need to have relevant background other than just rates and numbers. A good writer will actually give you and include the numbers and examples and so forth. Well, here's a good one here. Well, just think about this one. Car thefts on campus may have doubled. Now, if you said car thefts on campus have doubled, okay, you might think, God, that's a lot. And if I said car thefts have doubled in 1 month, you might say, wow. But if you have a campus of 20,000 students, and there have only been 2 cars stolen, and that's double compared to the month before, is that much to really worry about? Think about that. So again, we need complete information. The other thing you have to be careful about here too is over precision. Every year, this campus wastes 412,067 paper and plastic cups. It's time to switch. Well, that's a very huge number. And no one really knows the precise number. And I want to know how they got that number and where did they get it from. And it's extremely unlikely to be the same every year, is it? How could you get that same number every year? So you want to be wary of numbers that are easily manipulated. We do this all the time. Pollsters know very well how to ask the question. And sometimes there are polls that are made specifically to create more confusion. And that's the whole, that shouldn't be the case, but that happens, and the question is, how accurate, and sometimes accuracy is not the issue here. And it depends, every poll depends on how and what the question is. And a lot of times we call them push polls. Polls are often try to change people's minds. Here's a good example. They'll call you on the phone and they'll say, do you prefer candidate A versus candidate B? And then they'll say, well, if I told you that candidate B was convicted of a sex crime, would that change your mind? Well, of course it's going to change your mind. But at the same time, and do we know if it's true or not? We don't know for sure, okay? So we have to be careful. Many statistics are based on guesswork and extrapolation and data about, illegal and illegal activities. Since, and some people, have a major motive to not to reveal or report things like drug use or under-the-counter things or hiring illegal aliens and the like. So we have to be careful. And the thing is this is something, important. Beware of those confident generalizations. Beware of the manipulation. If somebody were to say to me that there were exactly 412,067 paper and plastic cups that were wasted last semester, I might believe them, but I'd want to know how they got that number, and I'd want to know how could they be that accurate? What did they do? Count the cups every day? How did they, and what did, you know what I'm saying here, folks? This is kind of hard. And you also want to consider things like counterexamples. Now, a counterexample can help a generalization. Consider this argument that we talked about, okay? We said, French fries are unhealthy, milkshakes are unhealthy, deep fried chicken and cheeseburgers are unhealthy. Therefore, all fast foods are unhealthy. Okay, that's not really good. This argument provides good examples, but one can think of other counterexamples. And you'll find that the argument is really overgeneralized. If you can think of counterexamples, for example, when you go into a fast food place like McDonald's, salads, they offer salads. That's not unhealthy, and that's considered fast food. What about yogurt? What about other items that are offered in the menu. Granted, you could probably say maybe a good portion of the menu is a little high in sugar, high in fat, and high in carbohydrates, and probably not the greatest for you. But there's also a portion that is not part of this. So you have to consider those counterexamples. And then once you consider that there are counterexamples and understand what they are, and this could be for any generalization, and then you realize that, this is an overgeneralization. If you can think of them, then you need to adjust your generalization. In other words, if you can, once you make a generalization and you have found that there are a lot of other ones out there that don't fit. In other words, if you can find a lot of counterexamples, then you probably need to adjust your generalizations. In other words, adjust your wording, adjust your generalization. And it also makes you think more deeply about the argument that makes them more unhealthy. I mean, on the one hand, you could say, well, a milkshake is very unhealthy, could be very high in sugar and high in carbohydrates, but it's not. If you had a milkshake every day, that might be a bad thing for you. But is it really unhealthy? I don't know. So you might have to change that to say highly processed foods, meat and cheese and milkshake ingredients tend to be fattier or unhealthy. So when you do, so you can see how we've done this. They've made it more specific. And if somebody were to come back with an argument and say, well, what about salads? Well, we weren't talking about salads. Salads aren't highly processed foods. Well, so that doesn't count. So maybe what you really want to say is that the demand for quick cooking and cheap standardized ingredients needs to make the result a less healthy choice. That's what happens when we do that. Ask yourself about counterexamples when you are assessing other arguments as well, especially when you're as well as your own. Ask whether their conclusions might have to be revised and limited. And as you are looking at your colleagues' papers, think about this. Are they making, are they saying that if we were to make the argument, all immigrants that come to the country undocumented are criminals? Well, are they? And that's the question. First, define what you mean by criminal. Secondly, what are we talking about here? You may have to revise and rethink and be more subtle. The same rule applies for both arguments and yours too. So the only difference is that the only difference here is that as you're evaluating it before you write your final paper, the difference is that you have a chance to correct your overgeneralization. Okay, whereas a lot of people in print can't do that, and they have to live with the consequences of it. And some of them aren't so great. So, as you're doing this, you want to think about this and try to be careful as you are looking at your generalization. Okay, and I hope to see you guys to answer any questions you might have later in this week. Thank you, folks.